go up, but that would go down.
That would go down.
But all this force would go down. But that would change as it actually moved. Really. Hey, Cleb, did you see that X-ray over there?
Yeah, I did.
Isn't it weird? Not the young lady. Okay. Which means all this force is causing a downward rotation. If I push this way, it'll all go that way. Now, any muscle and just simplistically, brachialis attaches at a certain angle. That is known as the angle of attachment.
Excuse you.
Sorry.
Oh, you're recording?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what a muscle needs to do is provide stability at the articulating surfaces. Take that, you can't really prove it one way or the other. And what is important about motion is the axis of rotation. You specify any joint in the body by its axis or axes of rotation. Okay, that be the axis of rotation. Okay? So this muscle is exerting a force. It is contracting, and this would be, what kind of contraction? Oh, we didn't do that actually. Concentric contraction. Okay. So I can determine that some of this force is going to produce motion, and some of the force is going to produce stability. That is the component which is going to produce stability. But that's not going to produce rotation because it has to be at right angles to this one, which is more or less this way. Okay. So I would have two components, the vectors. If we did break down the vector of the force of the brachialis, we would have two components, a stabilizing component and a rotating component. Okay, so we would have a momentum. A momentum would be the graphic representation of the percentage of the force which is producing rotation. The momentum is the picture, the graphic representation of the percentage of the force which is producing rotation. Remember we did this? My biceps. Right. You don't, if you don't look at the fat, you can see my finger going. Okay. Now I am flexed. Notice what happens if I extend. My finger comes out. So the angle of attachment gets smaller, which means the momentum gets smaller, which means that less and less of the total force is producing rotation. Most of it is here, very little of it is here. I can use the momentum as a picture, just as a little drawing that I can sense that how much of the force is producing momentum. The bigger the momentum, the greater the rotary component. Mathematically, it's the sine and cosine of the angle of attachment. This angle right here. The sine of this angle, and assuming it's 45 degrees, I think 747%, 0.747% of it is producing rotation, 7.7% is producing stability. So I have the amount of the force, same thing here. All this 90 degrees is producing rotation. All right? And if it did this way, the angle of insertion would be 0, here's 90 degrees. In this case, all the force is doing displacement or stability in this case, and all the force is doing rotation. So the momentum is just a graphic representation of right angles to this. And it will change. The size will change the same as it does here. Is that confusing, or should I try it again, make it more confusing? Huh? What? It is confusing.
It's just hard to see what angles, what.
Yeah, it's weird when you like.
Oh, it's hard to picture. Let me draw this again.
Well, he shows motion as flexible.
That's why you get less rotation.
That's the brachialis. It's this angle.
Like, obviously you need a perpendicular force to rotate your arm.
And if that were a vector, let me put the vector here. And a important element in diatorial joints of production motion is stability. And how do you produce stability? Which would be having the force go through the axis of rotation and the basis of support. It's the same thing, I'm sure, that Dr. Byrne talked about the supraspinatus and why, if it's out, you can't elevate. Okay, which isn't true because you use other sorts of muscles as well. What do you mean? No, I thought you said no.
Oh, no, I was just asking him a question about
Oh, okay. So, why that doesn't occur with the deltoid is that if we had the deltoid initially, its stabilizing component, if it tried to go through the axis of rotation, would bypass the glenoid fossa and therefore would dislocate. If I just use the deltoid, it would dislocate. That's why I need the supraspinatus to do this. And then the deltoid does that, because the angle of the deltoid will be changed as I abduct. Unfortunately, that's not really true. If you're over 50, I could, for all I know, have a ruptured supraspinatus muscle. Why would that be? Because I would have other muscles that would do that. I don't think I have it like that, but anyway. I could. So if you get a patient who can still do that, I saw a patient who was a javelin thrower. No, I didn't see it. I was at a conference where I saw this guy. Javelin throw, totally ruptured supraspinatus. He pushed up a resident that was holding on. He just pushed him away with a ruptured supraspinatus muscle. All right. The angle changes. We need the angle, the stabilizing component, to go through the axis of rotation and the base of support for stability. If we don't have that, we have dislocation in the deltoid. So not all the muscle, not all the force of the muscle, which is the physiological cross-section, which we didn't discuss, and it's the second part on the length-tension relationship that I handed you guys to have. So the total force of the muscle, some of it needs to produce stability. If it ain't doing that, supposedly you ain't getting any motion. So if you took some of it to produce stability, the other part will be producing motion. And what happens because of this, I can put my finger underneath the biceps, right? Now, blunt tension, remember we squeeze fingers? Remember, if you flex, you have less and less force? Okay, why? Because these muscles shorten. But I'm about as strong at each of the range of motion. Why? Because this is hard to say. Listen, as the muscle shortens, according to Blitz's curve of Starling's law of the heart, as the muscle shortens, it exerts less and less force. The physiological force is reduced. However, the rotary component increases. So you have a torque curve. If we went from extension to full flexion at the elbow, we would have a force curve something like this. That during the, except for the edges, the ends, my force would be about the same, because even though my muscle is getting weaker, more and more of the less muscle force, hard to say, less muscle force is producing rotation.
And that just simply means that, like, as the biceps brachii become smaller, then the coracobrachialis will then pick up from there?
No, not really. That's any individual muscle. That would be the brachialis. With the biceps, that has all sorts of other things associated with it.
So are you trying to say, like, as the muscle gets shorter, it gets easier to flex, though?
No,
Is that
it
what
doesn't
you're
get
trying to say?
easier. The force remains about the same. I would have as much strength about here as I would here, even though the muscle is getting shorter. At the extremes, I don't.
Because the angle's changing.
Yeah, but as the muscle gets shorter, the angle of an attachment or insertion gets larger, so it means more and more of the rotary force is produced. Even though the total force drops, more and more of that force is producing rotation.
So basically it's the torsional portion of the force that matters and stays consistent, even though the overall force is changing.
Yeah. Which is great if you think of the body